Let's jump into baking our textures. We'll start by duplicating the mesh that we have. And what I'm doing is turning on random colors for workbench view so that we can tell the difference between our identical meshes. And I've renamed it target because it's going to be the target of our bake. Now that we have UV editor on the left hand side, we can see the materials that's currently being used. It's a mess, it's huge, and there are multiple of these actually assigned to the mesh when it comes from Meshroom. We want to bake this all down to a single 4K material. So we need to UV unwrap on the target object. And what that does is gives us a better UV to work with. I've duplicated the target again because we're going to need a cage object for our bake. The way this works is the original high poly will shoot out rays from the surface that are caught by the cage and translated to the target. We want to scale up the cage just the tiniest bit so that it does have so the rays have somewhere to go rather than just not leaving the surface. I'm just checking to make sure there's no protrusions from the original mesh through the cage. We need to select the original and we need to put in what the target mesh is going to be and what the cage mesh is going to be. I'm using Simple Bake. This is a plugin that just makes it easier to use Blender's bake options. It does cost, and you can use Blender's defaults to do this, but we're just going to bake a diffuse at 4K and make sure our materials do export and hit bake. Oops. I did not fill in the two fields that are target and cage, so I need to do that. Now we can bake. And there we have it. It baked a 4K map for us for the diffuse map, which we will apply in a new material to the target. To do that, I'll start by just removing all the materials that came as default from the Meshroom application. I'm going to rename our material. It doesn't matter what it's called, I'm just calling it baked. And we'll open up the material editor. Here we have a principled BSDF. We'll add an image node and we'll select that diffuse map that was just generated and plug that into the primary color node. And there it is. We should put a HDRI in here for some lighting so that we can see what it looks like in rendered mode. So for that we go to the World tab, change to environment, and choose our HDRI. I'm gonna go with kind of a desert looking scene because it kind of matches the coloring of the rock that we have. And in rendered mode, we can see how glossy it is, which it's way too glossy. So what we're going to do about that is we'll add a black and white node, a convert to black and white, and a color ramp to plug into the roughness node of the BSDF. The color ramp will be used to adjust the high and low glossiness, or roughness rather in this case, and how much of a difference there is between the two. I'm looking at this extreme angle where you can see all that reflection and toning it down a bit, making things rougher because there's a lot of dirt on this and the rock is really not that glossy to begin with. Look dev mode is going to show more gloss than there actually is. That's why I was in rendered mode, rendered view. Now we're going to decimate the mesh to make it slightly lower polys or a slightly lower poly count. I'm going to make it 5% of what it is, which takes it from 644,000 plus down to 32,000 polygons. So that's a lot better, a lot easier to render. I should note that this should have been done prior to unwrapping the target and baking. I lost some definition in the texture doing it in this order. But at this point, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. It still looks pretty good. And that's it for the reduced high poly model. Now we want to make the low poly version, which is kind of the more interesting part of this process. We make an icosphere, give it 4 subdivisions, and then we'll give it a shrink wrap modifier and just shrink it down to match the surface of the original mesh. And we just use the eyedropper to do that. There it is. Now we want to remesh that to make it all quads and not so messy. So there's a remesh modifier in the latest builds of Blender. So there we go. We can adjust how dense that is, but I like where it is, so we'll just apply these. I should also note that when baking, all objects should be in smooth shading. Otherwise you get a faceted bake. So here we go, we did the same process again, unwrapped the low poly. And I'm going to move things around to kind of pack it in a little better so that we have a little more definition. And after taking all this care to do this, I find after the bake that I do have to do this again, but you can count it as a learning experience at my expense. I'm just renaming it low poly. And the duplicate's going to be cage again. We deleted the other cage, so the naming can be the same as it was. We'll scale that up a little bit along normals. I'm not just scaling the entire object, I'm scaling along normals, which is Alt S rather than just S on the keyboard. The cage does not need to be unwrapped, only the target does. It happens to be unwrapped because we just duplicated the target. And we're going to include normals in the maps that we're baking this time. We should have done that on the previous model as well for the high poly, but we did things in reverse order. There we go, there's our normal map. And you'll notice this big green splotch. That's a matter of rays not reaching a surface or going through a surface and hitting something wrong. We don't need the bottom of the mesh anyway, so I'm just going to delete it and we can unwrap again, and then we have more surface area available in our UV map. So it actually turns out better in the end for this one. I scaled it on the Z-axis to 0, unwrapped again, move things around a little. Scale it up from the cursor. And we're baking again. This can take some time. And there we go. That's what we want. Red, green, and blue, that's all we want to see. No greens, or no olive green. Just hiding the high poly again. And I'm making a collection for each geometry complexity level, just so that I can hide them easily with the check mark. It's not just hiding them, it's disabling them from the render view and from the final render output. Now with low poly, we'll take another look at the material on it, or create the material rather. This time we have a normal map to put in there with our diffuse map. So I'll do that right now. We'll just duplicate this. And we need to make sure that we put a normal map node in there, but the image node in which the normal map is needs to be set to non-color. Otherwise your normals aren't going to look very good. I'm doing the same thing we did for the roughness map on the other model, a black and white converter to a color ramp. Load up the diffuse map. The one with a 0 next to it is the one that's not assigned to anything. Same goes for the normal map. sRGB for color. So there it is, just flat with the diffuse, and we plug in the normal, and it's like magic. Now it's way too glossy, but we've got all that detail. The detail you get from a normal map, by the way, does not detract from your render times, or it doesn't require the same amount of power it does to render all that detail that's actually in the original scan, because there are so far fewer vertices to deal with. And the normal map is reflecting the light as if the geometry were there. We're going to bake the roughness map so that we're not using nodes for this. This way, when we take the exported mesh to something like Maya or 3ds, or even if you're putting on Sketchfab or something, or a game engine, you have a roughness map to use. Again, here I had an option checked that shouldn't be checked. I'm just baking to itself, no target, no cage. There it is. So we'll duplicate the non-color node, non-color image node, rather, and delete these. Now, of course, if we don't like the roughness that it has, we can still adjust it with a color ramp. But you won't be able to do that if you throw it into another program. So you want to get it right when you export. I really did not play with it enough here, but for the sake of the walkthrough, it's good enough.